Hello and welcome to Arithmetica. This is our 7th episode in our program in Proof and Reasoning and marks our 3rd video covering Abductive Inference. In the previous 2 videos, we introduced Abductive Inference and provided some of its applications, most chiefly that of its use in science in the forming of hypotheses. In this video, we shall provide some of the various definitions of abduction. In the previous videos covering abductive inference, we frequently described abduction informally as inference to the best explanation. In this and subsequent videos, we shall provide the formal definition of abduction as presented by those during the early years of its development, and with regards to its applications. In particular, in more recent times, that in AI, that is, artificial intelligence. Indeed, we have already commented in the last video how we might identify abduction as distinct to deduction or induction. Fundamentally, abductive inference is not predictive, unlike deduction and in many cases, induction. It is said to go backwards from a given conclusion to search for the premises that the conclusion was based on. Indeed, the word abduction has the components of ab and ducto, meaning leading back. This is also seen in Hanson's literature on abduction, where he uses the word retroduction as an alternative to abduction in emphasizing its non-predictive status in contrast to deduction and in many cases induction. The exception of the rule is with regards to induction by generalization, which could be considered as a form of abductive inference. Thus, in accepting this, it would follow that not all forms of inductive logic are predictive. Indeed, the subject of induction by generalization as a special case of abduction will be investigated in the next video in the series, as the second part of this presentation. In our introduction of abduction, we did honour accrediting much of the initial development and initial popularity and acceptance of abductive logic to the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. One of Peirce's earlier formulations of abduction was in the 1867 publication The Natural Classification of Arguments, where Peirce employs the formal structure of a syllogism by way of demonstrating the formal difference between what he regarded as the 3 main processes of logical inference, namely of deduction, induction, and hypothesis, or otherwise called abduction. He achieves this by arguing how the fundamental structure of the statements in a syllogism concerning the components of predicate, middle, and subject are featured differently for those 3 forms of logical inference. Later, in 1878, Peirce's publication Deduction, Induction, and Hypothesis abandons the formal requirement for the attention of multiple characters referencing the middle, subject, or predicates, while still acknowledging their worth, but instead structures its importance concerning the formal arrangement of the general forms, conforming to that of rule, case, and result of a logical argument. In this publication, Peirce provided a simple example in demonstrating this alternative interpretation of the 3 forms of logical inference. We are presented with a bag of beans, whereupon a handful may be taken from this bag. In each case, 1 and 2 are the premises, while 3 is the conclusion. Let's start with deduction. 1. Rule. All the beans from this bag are white. 2. Case. These beans are from this bag. 3. Result. Therefore, these beans are white. This has the property in which if 1 and 2 are true, then 3 is true. Induction. 1. Case. These beans are from this bag. 2. Result. These beans are white. 3. Rule. Therefore, all the beans from this bag are probably white. This has the property in which if 1 and 2 are true, then 3 is probably true. And finally, abduction. 1. Rule. All of the beans from this bag are white. 2. Result. These beans are white. 3. Case. Therefore, these beans are probably from this bag. This has the property in which if 1 and 2 are true, then 3 is probably true. By 1900, Peirce abandoned his previous syllogistic form of abduction for a new and definitive logical form. Peirce's logical form of abductive inference. Let C be some statement or statements of facts, and A be another statement purported to explain C. 1. The surprising fact that C is observed. 2. But if A were true, then C would be a matter of course. 3. Hence, there is reason to suspect that A is true. This form clearly emphasizes the role of abduction as logical inference in as far as providing and justifying a hypothesis to account for some fact, e.g. observation in science. Given Peirce's fascination in hypothesis building in science, this form seems best in representing this, and it should perhaps come to no surprise that it became his final and definitive form for abductive inference. Peirce's view that abduction is key to the scientist's process of forming a hypothesis highlighted its importance in scientific methodology, in which Peirce emphasized when he written, "Every single item of scientific theory which stands established today has been due to abduction." Indeed, the aforementioned American philosopher of science, Norwood Russell Hanson, regarded Peirce as the discoverer of abduction and greatly supported the Peircean account of abduction. Hanson proceeded further in justifying the importance of the role that abduction played in scientific discovery by providing a number of case studies in which abductive inference can be made applicable. For Hanson, the scientific discoveries of Kepler's laws of planetary motion, Newton's theory of gravity, and Darwin's theory of evolution all included abduction as a primary component in their discovery. Unsurprisingly, Hanson's own interpretation of abductive inference is not too dissimilar to Peirce's definition. Hanson's definition of abductive inference. Let H be a hypothesis. Premise 1. Some surprising phenomenon P is observed. Premise 2. P would be explicable as a matter of course if H were true. Conclusion. Hence, there is reason to think that H is true. The aforementioned logical forms of abduction, and in particular of the Peircean account, has induced interest among a number of logicians. One such philosopher was Quang Fan, who in 1970 provided his own interpretation. Fan's interpretation of Peircean abductive inference. Let C be some statement or statements of facts, and A be another statement purported to explain C. 1. The surprising fact that C is observed. 2. If A were true, then C would be a matter of course. as logically equivalent to the conditional statement if A then C. 3. If we accept the above two statements as true, then it follows via a logical inference rule called modus ponens or modus ponendo ponens, Latin for mode that affirms by affirming, where we are affirming the antecedent, that we can deductively infer the truth of the consequent, that is, C is true as required. 4. Hence, there is good reason to suspect that A is true. Thus, Fan interpreted Peirce's definition as including the form of a conditional statement, in that each abductive inference is accompanied by a corresponding conditional statement, which then reduces abduction to a deductive inference. Fan was not the only philosopher to interpret Peircean abduction as having a sort of reverse modus ponens. The Hungarian mathematician George Pólya provided to what he described as a process of heuristic inference in his 1945 publication How to Solve It, as well as in 1954 with his book Mathematics and Plausible Reasoning, Volumes 1 and 2, among others. Although Pólya does not describe his heuristic inference as being or including a process of abduction, he does nonetheless describe it as a form of plausible inference. Indeed, it is generally accepted that abduction satisfies the form of both presumptive and plausible inference. However, many but not all plausible arguments are abductive, although both tend to be presumptive in nature. Pólya also compares his heuristic inference with that of the deductive inference called modus tollens, or modus tollendo tollens, Latin for mode that denies by denying, that is, denying the consequent. Pólya's justification of abductive inference, a process of heuristic inference. Modus tollens. 1. If A then B is true. 2. B is false. 3. Therefore A is false, where 3 follows from 1 and 2 by necessity. Heuristic. 1. If A then B is true. 2. B is true. 3. Therefore it is more credible that A is true, where 3 does not follow by necessity from 1 and 2, but may be said to be a plausible truth. Despite Pólya's heuristic inference clearly being non-deductive when contrasting it with the deductive inference of modus tollens, one may argue that it provides a greater degree of likelihood of being true, i.e. as more credible as Pólya states. But what is clear is the backwards process of inference concerning its structure, a property that we have already reported to be fundamental to abductive inference. And so, rather than affirming the antecedent to infer the consequent, as in modus ponens, it affirms the consequent to infer the antecedent, a sort of reverse modus ponens, but without the certainty of being true. Both Fan's and Pólya's interpretation of abductive or heuristic inference require that the fact or observation follows deductively from the proposed hypothetical conclusion. We also see this interpretation of abductive inference as inclusive of what has been referred to as the formal definition in logic of abduction. Let T be a theory, A a proposition, and C an already established true proposition, an observation, fact, etc. Then A is abductively inferred from C with supporting theory T if, that is, C is deductively derived from T and A, where T is a collection of statements which are true under some interpretation in logic. Thus, A is a propositional statement that fits the facts, data, i.e. of proposition C, and supported by T, in which there is no contradiction. In other forms of the above definition, the condition for C to be deductively inferred from A and T may in principle be relaxed in favour of induction. In this case, we only require C to follow inductively from A and T. We also note that if A is strong enough to derive C alone, then T can be taken to be the empty set. In context, there would be no apparent need for a supporting theory. Thank you for watching part 1 of this presentation covering some of the formal definitions of abductive inference. In the second part, I shall continue by providing a brief overview of abduction in artificial intelligence, or AI. And so until next time, it's goodbye from Arithmetica.